is people who've stood outside the courtroom and say, Your Honor, will you defend my common law rights? And they don't answer, and they don't step into the jurisdiction. They can't touch them. They know that. But when a judge says, do you understand the rights I've said to you? The word spelling, we're under a spelling. Understand means stand under. Just flip the word. Understand, you stand under me. You say, yes, I understand, therefore you're in his jurisdiction, you're under his control. So you see, the wording is all about language. Language has a magic or a power, right? And if we
Jordan Maxwell, who first alerted me to that, knows there's Spark's book out there, The Order of Reality.
Right.
It's amazing.
It's about waking up to that.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's not. It's all.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. So they create a corporate entity, which is the capital name on your driver's license and birth certificate, and that's not you. It's the corporate shell you, and they tax that. As a matter of fact, there have been cases in the U.S. where people who are asserting their natural law rights say, I'm suing my corporate entity for taxes collected from me, and they've won.
I have to try that.
They've won. There have been cases, it's up on the internet, you can read it, the legal case where judges have said, you're right, we've been taxing the corporate entity and we owe you, this guy got $680,000 or something back, taxation over a lifetime. So they're pulling a big fraud on people, and as soon as you withdraw consent, one of the guys who does this ITCCS website, Andrew Patterson, he's a real expert on that. He lives on Vancouver Island with me. And he says you can withdraw consent, you put a statement of claim against the system, a statement of right and claim, and you simply say, I was unaware that this is my real stature in society because I was not informed. And by you not informing me, you committed an act of fraud on me because there's implied consent. We think we are implying your consent because you haven't objected. That's like, like the mafia boss saying, all right, I'm going to collect $100 from every one of you. Anybody object? Right? So nobody objects because we're all afraid. Well, that's fraud because they're intimidating you to go along when that's what the whole society is based on. So then you write the statement saying, I wasn't aware that this is my status. I'm now withdrawing consent from the system and I'm out. Here's my social insurance card back. I'm not the corporate entity anymore. At that point, you're free. They can't touch you. You don't get the benefits of the system, but you're free of it. And so you can ignore police, you can ignore their laws, you're not part of it anymore.
But are you as free as the American Indians then you have no rights then?
Well, they were conquered. They can be free at any point too, but the point is there was such violence done against them, as this documents, that they're in such a state of trauma, most of them are just thinking, don't hurt me anymore. I'll do whatever you want, just don't hurt me. There's a few, like Yellow Quill and Kiapolano, who say, despite this, not only is it just the fraud I've talked about here, but there's a double fraud done against Indians, is that there was treaties done in their name, that a treaty is a state-to-state negotiation. And by signing a treaty, you recognize the sovereignty of the other party. Well, that's not what's happened in Canada, because every treaty is preceded by the words that it's all land and authority vests in the Crown. So they say, you're all ruled by the Crown, but we'll play this little game where we pretend to recognize your whatever, right? And so in fact what's happening now in Canada is by going into the treaty process for a certain amount of money, they become a corporation under the law. They become a municipality. They're not an indigenous nation anymore. They're a municipality where land can be bought and sold. And that's what it's all about, to get the native band to give up their sovereignty and become a corporate entity, which is then in their jurisdiction. It's always about jurisdiction and where you stand, right?
If they're still under the British Crown, the Canadian Indians,
Yep.
doesn't that then bring them under the European human rights jurisdiction?
It should. But they deferred. This has been tried before. The Mohawks went to the League of Nations in 1924. And they said, genocide's been done against us. We never signed, we're indigenous Six Nations Haudenosaunee people. And the League of Nations deferred to Canada.
What about if they went to Strasbourg now?
Probably the same thing, because when we did our tribunal in 98, we sent all of the information to the UN and they never acted on it because Canada intervened and said, this is our jurisdiction. Indians are you see, in 1960, Indians were given the vote in Canada, and therefore they can pretend that they're citizens when they're still under the Indian Act. It's kind of like this. There's two faces Canada has. There's the face of the world and the face, the real reality. Like, they've got this Truth and Reconciliation Commission they've set up now. The churches and governments set it up to investigate themselves. And you can name names, you can't sue the churches, you know. So that's the face they have to the world, that, oh yeah, we're investigating this. In reality, you don't have any rights as an Indian because you're not a citizen under the Indian Act. So it's like the word apology. Here's language again, okay? The common understanding of an apology is, gee, I'm sorry, I regret what I did. Okay, that's the human. An apologetic in English is a defense of one's acts or a defense of somebody else's acts. So how can you be defending your action and also regretting it? You can't. They're two opposite ideas stuck under one word. And English does that because English was created by lawyers. When the Normans conquered, what is the Norman Empire? It's the Vatican. Just like in 1213, King John, just before he signed Magna Carta, signed the Treaty of Verona with the Pope, which made him a vassal and Pope in return for money because he was broke. I haven't ever found anything to suggest that the Treaty of Verona has been declared null and void. So legally, that's a good question. Is the Crown a subsidiary of the Vatican? And a piece of evidence about that is when I was ordained into the United Church, it said, which is a Protestant denomination, it said that that so-and-so is a minister of the United Church, and then it said within the Holy Catholic Church. And I said, wait a minute, what is this? So I asked one of my profs about it, and he said, oh no, that just means universal. I said, well, no, we're not part of the Catholic Church, we're a Protestant denomination. And if the Crown of England is a subsidiary of the Vatican, then so is the United Church, which was created by the Crown in 1925 by an Act of Parliament. So that might be a piece of evidence that in fact it is all one authority that we're operating.
Well, since then, the Crown is subservient to European law. They can claim their margin of appreciation, but their ability to act is not unlimited. They're limited by European human rights law. So
I find the European human rights law is enacted when, I find, for the benefit of the elite when it suits them, and to our detriment when it suits them as well. That's what I found like with most legal systems.
Sure, but states do lose in Strasbourg.
They do occasionally if someone is willing to, if someone is willing to go and has
I'm
and do it.
I'm not saying that it isn't worth kind of trying that, but
It's a
I'm
good
just
idea.
kind of realistic after years of going through the official channels that you see how what states tend to defer to one another rather than on behalf of the indigenous nations within that.
And the very idea of having they set up a committee, a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, to essentially investigate themselves. It's rather like the 9/11 Commission was exactly the same thing. You know, the government set up a committee to find out exactly what happened, you know, where they would be the judge, jury and executioner, so to speak, you know.
One of the comparisons that I find really, or should I say contrasts, that I find really striking is between the history of the Australian Aborigines and the history of the Canadian Aborigines in terms of the stolen generations. And I'm appalled at how backward Canada is. It's just absolutely not.
It's really similar. South Africa, Australia, Canada, they're really similar societies. They're like settler states where, you know, this foreign group came in and they had to get rid of the indigenous people quick. And Canada had to happen in one to two generations when the railway linked the country. They had, because you see, in the late 1800s, the Americans were moving like that, and the British were afraid they were going to grab all of Western North America. And so they had to settle it very quickly, and that's why the railway was built. And in about 20 years, this massive European settlement in the West, and right before that, they brought in the Indian Act, the RCMP, the residential schools to just finally contain them all. When the RCMP were created, their mandate was to clear all Indians within 50 miles of the railway. I mean, it was just, it's all there when you look it up. You know, it was clear that that was their purpose from the very beginning.
In truth, you know, what we're talking about, like how you see the parallels between the different situations. We were discussing this earlier, and Right? I mean, you can go back 2,000 years, and the Roman Empire was doing the exact same thing in this country and across Western and Southern Europe. Yeah, well, both phases, the official phase, which is the Roman Empire, and then the phase 2 of the Roman Empire, which is the church after the empire fell, the nominated empire fell, the covert empire of the church came up, and that was much more successful. It got into Scotland, it got into Ireland, and they did exactly the same thing. And we've seen this pattern emerging throughout history, all places, times. It's the same thing happens.
I love the only Englishman ever to become a pope. It was Adrian IV, and it was right when Henry II was about to invade Ireland in the late 12th century. And he published a papal bull called Laudabiliter, which means it is laudable. It's a laudable thing to invade Ireland. And he said in the law, because it was considered, as they still do, the Pope owns the whole world, and he can give any land he wants to anybody or take it away from the people who live there. So he said, I am giving Ireland to Henry II of England because the Irish are deficient in religion, and in return for receiving the proper Catholic religion, they will surrender their land. That's the trade-off. That's what it says in the papal bull. So,
and the Romans, the Caesars said,
and so we got the land. We got Ireland legally from the Pope that way.
And the Caesars say, they give us their grain and their land, we give them civilization, we give them nice straight roads and central heating. It's a fair deal. And it's outrageous.
Ideology right from the very beginning, and that you talk to any missionary, and still today in Thailand and other places they operate, they say exactly the same thing. We're bringing them civilization. If they have to lose their land and their language, so be it. They have to be brought up and made better. So,
I mean, just a thought that popped into my head when you were talking about the likelihood that the crown as an institution is actually subservient to the Vatican, to the Pope, is that I understand that, like William of Orange, he was always in the sort of schoolbook version of history as this great liberator, getting rid of this tyrant of the Stuart king, was actually and was a Protestant, was actually a cousin of the Pope at the time. Anyway, so you start to wonder, what are the real connections here? Are they playing one faction off against another, as is often the case?
I wondered that when I got ordained, I said, okay, well, my understanding of what Luther was saying was that he used the term priesthood of all believers, so you don't need priests anymore. And they said, no, that's not quite true, Kevin. As the minister, only you can say the words of institution during communion. And I said, what? And he took the bread and broke it and gave it to his disciples, and then they took the wine and said, this is my blood. Those words are called the words of institution. They say, no, we still believe that ministers are needed for that. And I said, so you do, in other words, we haven't abandoned this notion that the priest is an intermediary between God and the people. So you wouldn't believe that unless you were some vestige of Catholicism. So that began to open my eyes that they weren't who they claimed to be, the United Church. And so, just these little clues you get along the way if you're not brainwashed totally. You see that it's a big kind of fraud they're playing. So anyway, that's...
There's a lot of, I find a lot of, they'll come up with excuses as well for various things that happened, and they'll talk about them like it was somehow not their fault. I mean, we've been talking about Ireland. The famine, which is barely 150 years ago, it's been blamed on crop failures. Well, actually, if you go to the National Archives in Kew, you can actually see the shipping inventories, which were signed in Dublin and Cork and other harbours in Ireland, which proved that at the time of the famine, Ireland was one of the world's biggest food exportors.
Wheat and cattle are all being shipped over to England.
Yeah, everything.
And they were shipping to starving, like my relatives.
Maize, grain, honey, potato. Even some potato fields survived the blight.
That's why you shouldn't.
And they were but the potatoes were taken out of the country. Yeah. It's not famine. Famine implies it's some kind of natural disaster. An act of God. It's not.
Well, that's why they call them residential schools, because they weren't schools. Most of the time, kids weren't taught anything. They were taught enough to be slaves, and most of the time, people describing me, they had us washing walls. They had us as domestics, field workers when you're 8 years old.
It's Orwellian language, isn't it?
Schools, students. It's all about words and language, when you come down there.
Yeah, prisons of the young have gone by all sorts of euphemisms, training schools, residential care units.
Even the word abuse. rather than torture, murder,